6,000 square kilometers of forest, an area similar in size to the state of Delaware. That's how much was planted in the Soviet Union between 1950 and 1991. At the time when the planting process began, the forested area of the Soviet Union was already roughly the same size as the entire country of the United States. So why did the Soviets need more trees? What was the reasoning behind it? What drove them to start such a mega project? The reason was the drought, and the only solution was the planting of forest belts. For nearly a century, from 1891 to 1982, the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union were hit by severe droughts and famines no fewer than 27 times, and the cost of lives was in the millions, and each time the price was higher. The Tsar's famine. In 1891, a particularly dry spring had delayed the planting of the fields. That winter, temperatures fell to 30°C, but very little snow fell, and the seedlings were totally unprotected from the frost. When the Volga River flooded, the lack of fire caused the water to freeze, which killed more seedlings and the fodder used to feed the horses. The seedlings that were not killed by frost were blown away by the harsh cold winds along with the topsoil in an uncommonly windy summer. The summer started as early as April and proved to be a long, dry one. In the city of Orenburg, for example, no rainfall for over 100 days. Forests, horses, crops, and peasants all began to die, and by the end of 1892, about 375,000 to 400,000 people had died, mostly from the cholera epidemics that were triggered by the famine. It was one of the key moments that later helped triggering the 1905 Russian Revolution. But weather alone couldn't be blamed, as there was enough grain in Russia to feed the starving areas. That's why the main causes behind the deaths of so many citizens were not entirely because of the drought, but rather political. However, that's a story for another video. And the solution came a year later from Professor Vasily Dokuchaev, who proposed a network of forest belts to be placed in territories known to be problematic. The idea of such forest belts was not new. It had already been successfully implemented 6 years earlier, also in the Russian Empire, by Nestor Genko in the Ulyanovsk Oblast. The purpose of the forest belt created by Genko and proposed by Vasily Dokuchaev was quite complex. The forest was supposed to protect the water resources, restore soil fertility, and reducing soil erosion. But his plan was not implemented. Another 55 years had to pass before Dokuchaev's plan to create a network of forest belts came to life. And when it finally did, it was under the leadership of one of the most diabolical dictators in human history, Joseph Stalin. And his plan for the transformation of nature will shape the future of the Soviet agriculture forever. The Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature. The Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature, also known as Stalin's Plan for the Transformation of Nature, was proposed by Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union in the second half of the 1940s for land development, agricultural practices and water projects to improve agriculture in the nation. But why only then? Like many other significant events in Russian history, the grand plan to transform nature had its origins in a tragic event. Another famine. The Soviet famine of 1946-1947 was the last major famine in the Soviet Union and lasted from mid-1946 to the winter of 1947 to 1948. With a staggering mortality rate, estimated by historians to range from several 100,000 to several million, the 1947 famine certainly deserves its place among the most tragic events in Soviet history. It was the last straw for the Soviets. They had to come up with a plan to permanently combat recurring droughts and their devastating effects. It was Stalin who came up with an idea. The plan was outlined in the decree of the USSR Council of Ministers and All-Union Communist Party Central Committee of October 20, 1948. On the plan for planting of shelter belts, introduction of grassland crop rotation and construction of ponds and reservoirs to ensure high sustainable crop yields in the and steppe and forest steppe areas of the European USSR. The plan aimed to save the Soviet agriculture, which had been ravaged by the war effort in recent years, as well as by recurring droughts that caused famine and significant loss of life, all at the lowest possible cost. As mentioned earlier, Stalin's idea was not at all original. It had belonged to his predecessors, who, for one reason or another, had been unable to implement it. A project was proposed to establish an extensive network of shelter belts, or windbreaks, across the southern Soviet Union's steppes, modeled after similar efforts in the United States during the 1930s Dust Bowl. The idea was that planting rows of trees along rivers and around collective farms would block the drying winds from Central Asia, which were believed to contribute to the region's droughts. The initiative was accompanied by heavy propaganda, including a patriotic anthem, The Song of the Forests, composed by Dmitry Shostakovich. The project was overseen by the Main Directorate of Field Protective Forestry, under the guidance of a scientific committee that included Trofim Lysenko. Lysenko, who claimed expertise in tree planting, advocated for a method he called nests, where trees of the same species were planted together in dense clusters to support one another. According to Lysenko, the trees would undergo self-thinning, with some plants sacrificing themselves to help others thrive by reducing competition with weeds. He also proposed that an oak seedling could be surrounded by 4 other seedlings in a plus-sign pattern. However, by September 1951, ecologist Vladimir Sukachev reported that 100% of the trees planted using Lysenko's nest method in the Ural regions had died. Despite the failure of the project to meet its original objectives, some collective farms surrounded by these plantations saw improved yields due to better water retention. The implementation of field protective plantings in the Soviet Union brought positive results for agriculture, especially in the southern and eastern regions of the Ukrainian SSR. Crop yields saw noticeable improvements. The effect of planting field protective forest strips on the fields they shielded led to an increase in grain crop yields by 25–30%, vegetables by 50–70%, and herbs by 100–200%. However, the full realization of Dokuchayev's ideas was weak. When Dokuchayev first introduced his concepts, specialists were focused on creating forest belts, but by Stalin's time, this focus had shifted. Many of the people tasked with carrying out the plan lacked a proper understanding of the unique features of steppe ecosystems. Additionally, there were insufficient funds, and local authorities often neglected the initiative. In 1953, the Field Protective Forest Planting Program was scaled back. At the time, Nikita Khrushchev, with his characteristic voluntarism, showed little interest in advancing forest belts. His focus was on corn production instead. However, after the devastating dust storm of 1969, the government of the Ukrainian SSR decided to revive the Stalin-era plan. Over the next few years, several resolutions were passed to continue the work begun in 1948. Despite this, the scale of the planting efforts fell far short of creating a reliable, comprehensive field protective forestry system. In conclusion, the Soviet Communists' obsession with planting trees was not solely ideologically motivated, but rather emerged as a solution to a very real problem, one that had caused the loss of millions of lives throughout history. One thing is certain: the thousands of square kilometers of forests are, and will continue to be, a testament to an era of suffering that